Okay, so maybe we can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Oscar Oliver Didier. I'm a second year American Studies PhD student here at NYU. It is my pleasure to introduce Liza Weinstein, who is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Northeastern University. Her research and teaching interests focus on cities and globalization, urban political economy, the politics of informality, and state civil society relations, with a regional focus on India. She is the author of The Durable Slum, Dharavi and the Right to Stay Put in Globalizing Mumbai, and is currently completing a book titled The Logics of Dispossession, Local Histories of India's World-Class Evictions, which analyzes the shifting politics of housing insecurity and anti-eviction activism across urban India. For our urban research seminar, we looked at her recent project titled Urban Field Research During a Pandemic, which was published in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. In this very timely piece, 10 emerging scholars reflect on the unique challenges of doing or attempting to do PhD research during a global but geographically uneven pandemic. So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Professor Liza Weinstein.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Oscar, and thank you to Audrey and to Jacob and to others, everyone in the group and all attendees today for inviting me to participate. As I was saying, as we were starting to trickle in, I am not used to giving talks like this. Usually I give a more straight research talk based on my research. And I think given the strangeness of our times that have kind of forced reflections on topics that we kind of take for granted often, I think that the opportunity to talk about this feels like a real privilege to share some of my reflections that I've developed primarily as an advisor of PhD students, but also as an editor at the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, or IJUR. So I'm going to share some slides today, primarily because it's will organize my thoughts, not necessarily because they have a lot of information. If the host can enable screen sharing, then I'll just share my slides.
Okay, you should have access now.
Yep, I do. Thank you very much. Give me 1 second. All right. So the problem with that is I see fewer of you, but I can actually fix my screen so that I can see more of you and see my slides. So as I said, and as Oscar mentioned in my introduction, I've kind of organized my thoughts today and the comments that I'm going to make, and hopefully the conversation that we're going to have around the theme on which I organized a spotlight on a collection, web-based collection of essays based on the insights and my close relationship with 10 emerging urban scholars from around the world. I'll say a little bit more about, I'll say much more about that as we go on, but I've organized my talk on the theme that we use to bring together the scholars, really thinking about what it means to become an urban researcher, but thinking about that process of becoming as something that is continually reinvented and we have to continually contend with. So I'm going to organize my comments today really around 3 main topics. The first one is really kind of asking the question, in light of what we've learned during the pandemic, do we need to rethink urban research, how we pursue the questions that we ask, how we support our students support one another while doing field work, and thinking about how to redress the inequities that have been exposed through the pandemic. And obviously, as my answer should be fairly obvious in the organization of the talk. I propose, yes, that we do need to rethink how and other aspects of doing urban research. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my own urban research. It's often most useful to talk about these things with a concrete example. And I'm going to talk briefly about my research because, who passes up a chance to be able to talk about their research? But also because I think it's important to acknowledge that pre-pandemic, there are a variety of reasons why we must pivot and do different kinds of research from what we've done in earlier parts of our career. So I think that my experiences may be instructive on how some of these pivots are done, and then how that had kind of set me up for particular experiences during the pandemic, but also thinking about my urban research role as an editor at the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and then also graduate advising, and then thinking about some of the areas where we may need to rethink urban research. And that's the point at which I'd like to try to make this as participatory and as engaged as we possibly can. And you're in the thick of it, and you don't need me to tell you what's working and what's not for you. And I'd love to hear from you, particularly at that point. But feel free to jump in at other points as well. But I do think over Zoom it gets a little harder to do that. But you can still feel free to. I'll roll with it. But so, I think that the issue that the pandemic most focused our attention on was that inequalities were exposed, but perhaps opportunities emerged. We might be too much still in the thick of it to be thinking about opportunities. We're all still dealing with great difficulties in many of our lives, and in very uneven ways. But I think that there are some early things that we've begun to learn that might help us think through what a post-pandemic urban research future might look like. And I think the first one is the way that personal challenges have been revealed. The fact that there are really distinct issues for people doing research in a country other than which they are a citizen of and locally based in that moment. And I think that many of us started to understand with new urgency the experience that our international students were facing. And many of the students who I advise are not, are doing PhDs in the US, but are not US citizens and have come abroad to do studies and may be returning back to their home countries to do fieldwork, or maybe going to another country altogether to do fieldwork. And this really uneven and unequal experience of visas and the administrative barriers to travel were exposed with were put into very sharp relief during the pandemic. And the experiences that people doing research in U.S. cities or U.S. American students were facing were just, I would say, easier overall than the issues that the international students were facing. But everybody was dealing with different family pressures, whether they were parents or children or siblings. Our role as caregivers, came into conflict with the expectation that we can really just focus on our scholarship, and everybody sort of became acutely aware that we can't focus on our scholarship if everything else in our life is so complicated. And those personal challenges were really exposed in ways that we can't really kind of unsee them. And so that's But I think we also recognize that there were really different and uneven experiences with respect to advising and support networks. Support networks became really consequential during the pandemic, and I saw this, in my own research life, but also with, particularly with respect to my students, who some of whom had extensive networks on which to draw, advisors who understood what they were going through, peers who they could talk to and brainstorm research pivots and changes to their original plans, and I think that this exposure of the inequalities of these networks really helped me think differently about how we can strengthen the networks for those who don't necessarily have them as strongly. And thinking about funding, and particularly funding windows, that all of a sudden the fact that we had to do certain things in certain time frames, and sure, funding windows did get pushed back to some degree, but in many cases they, funding expires, and this is really produces a very uneven landscape of financial opportunities to do field work. And thinking about, and this is something I'll talk a little bit more about, the way that publishing becomes a luxury for some, that to actually, have the sustained amount of time to write the kind of long form engaged research articles requires that other things in your life are a little calmer. And so we saw publishing as a luxury, but we also saw not publishing as a luxury. And so for people who are on the tenure track, or for people who, need to get jobs, the ability not to publish is something that we saw people not really have. And so, I saw that in particular as a journal editor, where we saw that the people who were most likely to publish were in many ways the ones who kind of needed it the least in many ways, in this discrepancy between having the luxury to be able to do the work that can get your research disseminated and needing your research disseminated is a fundamental contradiction that I think we're going to continue to grapple with as editors and scholars for years to come. And again, like I said, I want to keep a question mark by the opportunities emerged, because I think these will only have been opportunities if we are able to actually learn from these lessons and actually institutionalize some of these opportunities and create more sustainable systems that allow for these opportunities to really benefit people. I mean, I think the fact that everyone was impacted created new opportunities. Everyone was impacted in different ways and to different extents, but all of a sudden people could see other people's struggles because they had struggles of their own, and there were a lot of conversations that are still happening about how my problems are problems and they're things I'm dealing with, but they're nothing in comparison to what other people are dealing with, but that constant sort of relativization of our experiences and the conditions under which we're able to do research created an opportunity for conversations that were never really had before. And I think this conversation is case in point. And the collection that I had the opportunity to edit as part of IJER, is created by the recognition that everyone is impacted. Thinking about new methods and methodological innovations, once you can't answer your research questions through some of the methods that you had originally intended, we have to think a little bit more broadly. I think this has been a boon for computational social science, and many of my colleagues who use more computational methods have had many students at their doors as they're trying to think about what kinds of research methods they can employ when the opportunity to travel to do particularly the deeply engaged travel-based ethnographic research is less feasible. And I'll talk about some examples of that as well. And I think, to some extent we've learned some things. I'm not exactly sure what we've learned fully about conferences, but I think we've had more opportunities for people who wouldn't be able to afford the travel to conferences to be able to participate and disseminate their work and get it out there. And I think that's something that we need to think more about. What are the models for web-based forms of communication that don't have the financial costs, don't have the carbon costs and the environmental costs that so much traveling that we were doing for the purpose of disseminating our research had pre-pandemic. So I kind of wanted to take a few more minutes than I probably should have to kind of lay out some of those issues, because they're going to be relevant for the points that I make as I move through my own experiences in research, editing and advising, and then I want to come back to these questions as we, or these issues, as we think about what it might look like to produce a post-pandemic urban research set of practices. So I have, I wanted to kind of lay out my dissertation story, because I think in many ways it was the ideal story, and it is, and I don't say this to really, rub it in anyone's face, or to say, but to acknowledge the privilege that, I had to have a decade to essentially to work on my dissertation research. It entailed, a 2-month field, pre-dissertation field visit. It entailed a 16-month, ethnographic time in Mumbai, conducting interviews, ethnographic research, historical archival research that I could only do in Mumbai. And then I got a job. I had time to, to publish the dissertation into a book. And when I talk about this as kind of a luxurious approach to doing research, I'm not only comparing this to the the period of the pandemic, but I'm also comparing it to my own period of having children and constraints in my life that, I couldn't do this kind of work now at this point in my life. And I wanted to kind of reflect on that. And so I just wanted to take a brief moment to think about, so then starting in 2009, I had children. This is sort of more personal details than I would typically give in a talk, but I think this is a personal kind of talk in the format of this talk. It's important to actually talk about the personal constraints that we face in our lives, and I'll come back around to this because I think that we've had more personal conversations this year, and I hope those are something that don't go away, because there's a hidden curriculum here that we want to expose. So starting in 2009, I had children. I had my second one in 2012, and my ability to go spend a year and a half doing field work was limited. I have, had great luxury to be able to travel with them, and they stayed with me in Delhi when I did a Fulbright fellowship in 2014. But I had to think about doing research kind of differently, and here I kind of lay out kind of 3 approaches that I have taken. This was pre-pandemic, but post-children, to thinking about doing a different kind of urban research than I was able to do for my dissertation. And the first one was, I'm starting my second major book project. I have 2 very, very small children at that point, and I know that this is not going to be an ethnographic research project. And I had a lot of comparative questions that had emerged from my dissertation research that I wanted to situate in historical and geographically comparative perspective, and I initiated a sort of a comparative project, and I'll say a little bit more about this, so I'm not going to dwell on it here, but thinking about comparative and historical methods, utilizing archival research, utilizing secondary research in many ways to tell a different narrative than has been told before, but to move away from ethnographic research, from the very fine-grained neighborhood level studies that I had been trained to do, to think broader about how those neighborhoods are situated in cities and situated in times that shape the outcomes of the people in those communities. And secondly, I've engaged more in collaborative projects and also smaller projects that I really feel I'm only prepared to do, I'm only trained and adequately equipped to do in Mumbai, where I'm able to draw upon my earlier research engagements, the fact that I had spent so much time in the field. I could do quicker hit trips that I wouldn't have been able to do, or I couldn't do in a place where I have to really learn the context. And so there's something cumulative about the research process, and I've been able to draw on that process when my ability to kind of spend longer periods of time doing work, and this isn't just because of children, but it's because of my teaching expectations, the fact that I have sabbatical only every 6 years, and I have much more limited time to collect data. And then third, I've also had the opportunity to apply for research funding to work on big collaborative projects that involve sort of multi-person teams and work with community-based researchers and employ different models, including community-based participatory research. And so I'll say a little bit more about that project also in a minute, but I kind of wanted to lay these three options out on a slide because I think that they're relevant for thinking about the kinds of research that we can do when we face constraints. And so the constraints that I faced in this case were not pandemic related, but the fact that I was sort of responding to other constraints in my ability to travel and in my ability to kind of do the deep kinds of engagements I wanted to set me up to sort of be relatively well prepared or able to continue the work that I was doing when the pandemic hit, because my work wasn't as dependent upon what I had earlier been trained to do. So this is also emphasizing that there are a variety of research or reasons why we must take research pivots. So I just want to say a very brief word because, like I said, we don't pass up opportunities to talk about our current research and to kind of get it out there. So the first project, was really about trying to situate the struggles around housing rights and dispossession that I had ethnographically researched in Mumbai into comparative and historical perspective. And so while the dominant paradigms that have been used to explain, or the dominant frameworks that have been used to explain evictions, slum clearance, dispossession, have really been focused on sort of global strategies of expulsions or transformations under late stage capitalism based, that has emerged, has sort of consolidated around forms of capital accumulation based on dispossessing people from one's public or accessible resources, and really feeling like while that told one particular part of the story, there was a need to historicize, to situate into historical context the forms of dispossession that we are observing today, and the need to localize, to demonstrate that there are different local experiences, that different local variations of that story of global dispossession. And so just to say very briefly, that this project is kind of focused on three bigger questions. One focused on the uneven geographies of dispossession to help us understand that, global capitalism localizes differently and interacts with local state structures in very different ways to produce different experiences even amid a similar set of motivations from local investors, local developers, local governments that may want to be pursuing. On this slide, I have WCC making, but this world-class city making. And thinking about, secondly, the shifting logics of eviction. So while the first is about geographical comparison, the second point is about historical comparison. Really trying to understand what's new about the new urban land grab, and to think about the fact that housing insecurity is not an altogether new phenomenon, nor slum evictions, and how can we understand this moment in a broader historical context. And then the second is about the third is about strategies of resistance. So I can come back and talk about my specific research, but I think I really just kind of wanted to give a broad overview. Secondly, I'm working on a project, and I'll say a little bit more about my methods in a moment, but this kind of fit into the community-based participatory research model that I'm employing, but really trying to think about what informal settlements or slums really are as residential collections. So I kind of trace, in framing out this project, I trace kind of three frameworks that can be sort of looked at chronologically to explain what informal settlements or slums are, with the first framework really being rooted in kind of this notion of self-help spaces or auto-construction, growing largely out of frameworks associated with the World Bank, or sort of an anti-state strategy, recognizing that in the face of state failure, here are these communities that come together through their agency and their social capital to create non-state solutions to the needs for housing. And that really was the sort of dominant, particularly developmental paradigm for informal settlements really through the 1980s and 90s. And then we begin to see kind of the emergence of a literature on urban informality that doesn't look at the absence of state power in the formation of informal settlements, but understanding the political negotiations and the state co-production of these spaces, that these are not in the absence of the state, but often these spaces are produced by the state. And that's kind of, has been the kind of key framework since the late 1990s around informal settlements. But in this project, we wanted to kind of think about illegalization. And so rather than sort of state production, a more antagonistic relationship to the state, where legal institutions and the police have created spaces outside of the law and have a very sort of exclusionary mode of governance. And so this work, and my research team and I, sort of came to this approach through immigrant health research, particularly undocumented immigrant research that has looked at kind of the illegalization of the immigrant body and the ways that those inequalities become embodied through a variety of preventable illnesses and ailments that are the product of this process of illegalization. And so in this project, I'm working with a team. We've counted our team recently, and there are about 20 people between the community-based researchers, the translators, the coders, the 3 PIs, myself and 2 other PIs on the project, and to really look at this. It's an NSF-funded project to look at how legal exclusion is produced and subjectively experienced in non-notified and notified slum settlements in Mumbai. And just to, I can come back around to this, but if folks are interested, but this community-based participatory research approach that's drawing on qualitative data, including life histories, life history interviews, community level ethnography, key informant interviews, and a variety of approaches, that I really have been able to be part of this project because it hasn't required that I spend considerable amounts of time. This is, given the sensitive nature of this research, this is not even research that I, as a non-Indian researcher, could really gain access to doing. And given the legal sensitivity and the health sensitivities, these are issues that are best addressed through community-based researchers, where people can be asking neighbors their questions, and community residents can be writing ethnographic field notes about their experiences and their interactions with the state in its various forms in the local community. And so, my engagement in this, in these 2 projects, and I just kind of wanted to highlight these 2 to demonstrate that I have thought about ways, and I think successfully found ways, to remain engaged with urban research without being physically present for the long periods of time that I had been trained to do, and that my doctoral research really prepared me to do, and that I love doing. And, and there is a sense of loss that, I think people experienced really acutely during the pandemic, but a sense of loss when the kind of research that you have prepared to do is not the kind of research that you're able to do in that moment. And so thinking about the ways that this need not be always such a loss, that there are really kind of deep, intellectually engaging research questions one can ask through a variety of research methods. And these are just some of those that I have come to in the course of my own research. But when the pandemic hit, so starting in March 2020, soon we forget, in March 2020, I had limited disruptions, partly because I had the more major personal disruptions at an earlier stage in my research, and my research was sort of set up to, in some ways, be remote. And so the transition to a largely remote work life was not personally, disastrous on my research program. I had barriers to travel. I had several field visits to the community, the non-notified community, where I'm doing ethnographic research with community-based researchers in Mumbai, Kalabandar. I had research plans that had to be canceled, but our research team was able to continue meeting via Zoom. The 4 community-based researchers on the project downloaded Zoom onto their phones, and we obviously don't use video, but we talk every other week, and they were able actually to continue doing ethnographic field notes during kind of the 2 major lockdowns, when they were largely confined to their homes and to their immediate vicinities. They weren't able to kind of type out field notes as they had previously been doing, but they made voice memos and they emailed them to us. And then we were able to, continue doing research and really observing how the lockdowns and the public health measures and the virus itself were impacting life within this community, and particularly how the community's sort of precarious legal status or forms of legal exclusion were shaping their access to resources, their access to employment during the lockdowns of the pandemic. And so because we already had this set up, community-based researchers doing ethnographic field research, we were able to more or less continue. And everybody was so aware of the challenges and the fact that everybody on the team had very different challenges that they were facing, and we were all worked to be to understand what others were experiencing on the team, but also to accommodate and to be supportive and there for each other, and and put zero pressure on anyone in the team to continue to do things that were increasingly challenging to do. But, I had children at home, engaged in homeschooling, and like most others, and but I continued writing. I had to do it really early in the morning before they woke up and before they went on to Zoom school and I went on to Zoom teaching. But I had minimal pandemic disruptions. Where I saw the most acute impacts were in journal editing, and in seeing in more or less real time who was able to be submitting articles and who was not, who was able to review articles, and who was more burdened than others during that process. But also in particular, and this is what I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time talking about, advising PhD students and seeing the unique challenges that they were facing, that the luxuries that I was afforded having made earlier research pivots and being more homebound and having the opportunity to be homebound because I had done engaged ethnographic field work earlier, were not opportunities that my students had. So briefly on the journal, so we met regularly in, so what I've posted on this screen is, is an image of the journal, but also the beginning of a statement that we sent to all of our authors and to all of our reviewers and posted on the journal website, We made the tough decision in, I think it was March or early April, to stop reviewing articles. And we knew that that would be difficult for people who needed articles published. We continued to work with authors and tried to support them through the writing process, but we didn't feel comfortable as editors sending articles out to be reviewed. Article reviewing is a professional service that we all do in the field, and it's necessary for research dissemination and publication, but it is a voluntary activity that most people were sort of unable to perform, and we didn't feel comfortable asking people to do so. By summer, we decided to begin reviewing articles again. But what we did was we prioritized articles written by PhD students and junior scholars, people without tenure, and then also women and scholars of color. And recognizing, we sort of had a queue, not to say that there was an easier publication process for anyone in the queue, but just that we were going to prioritize certain authors more, recognizing that other scholars may not necessarily, that scholars who have the greatest ability, as I had said, to publish may not be the ones who need it most in that moment. And so I think, as we've all thought about, just trying to scramble and make decisions as we were in the early months of the pandemic, we were really trying to figure out a set of solutions that would both utilize the opportunities that the journal provided while also trying to reduce to the limited extent that we could within one particular journal, some of the inequalities that had been exposed by the pandemic. But I also wanted to, and this is where I want to kind of spend a little bit of time talking about the Spotlight On and the 10 articles that you read for today. I saw the experiences of the pandemic sort of most acutely in my PhD students. Speaking first about my own PhD students at Northeastern, I actually had a couple of students, 2 students in particular, who were in the field and were more or less stuck in the field, and one in Turkey and one in Germany, and their ability to go home and to be with family was limited. Their ability to leave their apartments and do field work was limited, so they were kind of stuck in the field, unable to really do field work. And I recognized, and both of these students actually are international students. They're not US students. And interestingly, both are doing research in countries other than the ones they were from. So one of my students is Turkish, and she was doing research in Berlin. And another one of my students is Turkmen, and she was doing research in Istanbul. And they were, sort of stuck, unable to do work, but in need of support. And I've been running a discussion group, a weekly discussion group with my PhD students for a number of years, and just realizing that it's, collective advising works well together, works well rather than necessarily having to say the same thing to multiple students, bringing everyone together at different stages of the process and allowing the students who are still in field work to hear about the process of applying for grants from students further in the program, and the students who are in the process of applying for grants to hear from PhD students who are in the process of writing up. And so this sort of multi-stage kind of collective advising, peer advising of the PhD students who I advise, we switched remote, obviously, but we were able, I found, because of the remote format, to support one another in ways that we wouldn't have necessarily been able to do if we were meeting in person. So the in-person group really was only able to draw from the students who were in Boston, but the fact that we went to remote allowed us to bring in the student in Berlin, bring in the student in Istanbul, and talk out collectively the struggles that people are facing. And there wasn't anything to do. There really wasn't any problem solving, or wasn't much problem solving in those early months, because there were sort of very limited options. They couldn't go back, they couldn't do field work and actually go out and continue interviewing people. But I think things really began to change by summer, and people were grappling with what kinds of methods could they use, what kinds of risks were they willing to take, either in their own health, but also in the health of their informants, recognizing that while they may feel, comfortable masking up, is it really fair to impose their masked selves on communities who, we talk a lot about, kind of the power differential between ourselves and often the more marginalized and vulnerable communities that many of us do research with, and how can you really get permission in those, to be in those spaces. And so we're not only doing calculations for our own health and well-being, but calculations for the health and well-being of others, and the people that we're coming into contact with. And so at the time that I'm having these conversations with my own doctoral students, I'm also continuing to stay in touch with a group of students that I had gotten to know several months before in Delhi. So this is where I'm going to kind of leave my students aside and talk about the specific authors who contributed to the spotlight on becoming an urban researcher during a pandemic. So as part of my editorial responsibilities at IJR, and just also because I enjoy doing it, I work with the summer school that is run by RC21 of the ISA, the section on urban and regional development. And the journal IJR, funded through the IJR Foundation, sponsors every other year a 2 to 3 week intensive doctoral summer school. We actually have shifted away from calling it a summer school because that's sort of North-centric, and for many students in the global South, or for in the Southern Hemisphere, it's a winter school, but a doctoral school. And the idea is that people who are really kind of finishing up their field work in the writing stages come together with more established scholars, with one another, with people in the locality. And so in September 2019, this was organized in collaboration with the RC21 conference in Delhi. And so we spent 3 weeks with 25 students from around the world, kind of planning out and reflecting upon the urban field research process, with an emphasis on methods. Methodology is kind of what we, most of our interactions are sort of focused on. We were based at the Institute for Economic Growth at Delhi University, and really had a chance to get to know each other remarkably well. And for most of the students at the stage in the program where of their various programs that they were about to do fieldwork. They were really like on the precipice of doing fieldwork. Some had already started it and had kind of taken a break from it to come to the doctoral school. But that was in September. We stayed in touch. By March, everything was shut down. And so this group of students were most affected, given the stage in their studies that they were. And we had continued to stay in touch with one another through WhatsApp, and we were having conversations about what this process looked like. I was connecting some of them to my own PhD students who were engaged in research in various points, but we also recognized that there were some really interesting learnings that were kind of coming out of these conversations, and a few different pathways that researchers were following. And so we didn't necessarily have a clear objective in organizing the writings, but we all kind of decided that we would just have people write about their experiences. And so I edit this section called Spotlight On, which is afforded a sort of less constrained format for publication. It's a web-based set of conversations around a particular theme, briefer, sort of more public-facing essays than your general academic articles, but also the opportunity to be more reflective and to, you know, kind of meander a little bit, not just talk about the research findings, but also talk about the process of collecting those research findings. So we were thinking this would be a good format, and we, you know, just had people write. And what people wrote, I think it was hard, very hard for people to write in the beginning, because it was really emotional. And some people, you know, just given personalities, were able to, you know, kind of talk in a very straightforward way about, I did this and then I did this. But for other people, it was a much more emotional process. And what ended up together, we published in, did we publish September? I think we published it 1 year ago. A range of different writing styles and a range of essays, but with 10 contributors really offering deep, deep insights. And what I found most remarkable about their essays was really that everybody had a very different set of personal experiences, but everybody's personal experiences were illustrative, would be useful to others. And they wrote in such a way that I think, and you've had the chance to read these essays, that they wrote in such a way that I think a wide variety of people can connect with, despite the specificities of their particular circumstances. So we really saw kind of 3 different pathways for the researchers writing about their experiences. The first one was focused on kind of just plowing through. You're just going to keep doing what you're doing. You're going to do it in as humble a way as possible. You're going to wear your mask, and you're going to keep writing about what you're writing, either because the issues that you were initially writing about have become more important than ever. And this, I think, really comes up, and I just done a copy and paste to get just a sample of the first few essays, but I think the piece by Francesca, doing fieldwork in informal settlements, really illustrates that she was there to write about a housing crisis, and that housing crisis and eviction crisis became more pressing during the pandemic as housing insecurity became more significant. Similarly, another of the pieces, I think because we published them in a particular order and there was a logic to it, Gala and Leon published a piece really about kind of right-wing politics and political distances that were growing between people primarily in Eastern German cities, and that the politicization of the pandemic became something that they felt compelled to keep writing about. And so for this group of scholars, it was, I think they saw their research projects, their original research projects, with a new urgency, and continued to do work. And then there was a second group of scholars for whom the original plan either no longer seemed relevant or was no longer feasible. And they pivoted and they did very different things. One of the students' essays that I think is really just brilliant, that captures this very nicely, is by a scholar at the University of Michigan named Taru, who just realized that the need in the area where she was doing research, the needs were so great, she had to just kind of drop her research and use her urban mapping skills, her analysis skills to identify food needs and to participate on food distribution programs at the city level. And I think she recognized that she had a set of skills that she didn't know that could be as useful as they were. And she pivoted, and her dissertation then changed as a result. She reflected on, whether that was opportunistic on her part to then shift her dissertation. And there was a lot of sort of personal searching in that process. There were also, there were other essays that talked about sort of more minor shifts or more major shifts. In the case of Angana Mukherjee in Mumbai was unable to travel to her field site in Calcutta and had to just do a different kind of project than she had intended to. She was the mother of a small child and didn't feel like she could, even once travel restrictions were lifted, that she could leave her child to do work. And so thinking about, having to pivot your research not being the end of the world, I think, underscored a process of letting go that many of the researchers whose essays really reflected upon, but also through that process of letting go, kind of discovering new things about, different approaches to urban research, et cetera, that I think, this kind of fits in the opportunities set of categories. But then there was essays by, a third group that were really unable to keep doing the work that they were doing, either because they were physically separated from their field site and the research pivots were too overwhelming to make. They would have to really scrap everything and start from scratch and pursue a wait and see strategy, but also because, the personal challenges that many were facing were just too great to overcome. And I think it raised questions for them, and I think for us as well, about how much do we push through, how important is the research that we do relative to our relationships with our families and our relationships with with ourselves and our mental health. And I really, really appreciated the reflections by those scholars who were willing to kind of open up about those processes, and to say the things that don't often get talked about and that we're often taught not to talk about in professional academic settings. And I think that the more we do talk about issues of mental health and family struggles, help us support our students better and help us be more honest about what we are doing as researchers. So I think at this point, it's useful to kind of return to the questions that I had kind of posed in the beginning, and kind of open back up, and to think about ways that we can and should be reflecting upon rethinking urban research. I think that the three approaches that the students' essays reveal, the find a plan B, develop new methods and approaches, which is kind of the middle strategy, the wait and see, which was really the sort of immobilized response, understandably immobilized. There's zero judgment there. But then the keep on keeping on with masks and other supports was what I meant. And that really gives us a framework for thinking about post-pandemic research. But also, and again, I forgot a word. This last slide was maybe a little incomplete, but advising and peer support, but especially peer support. I found that the students who, that all of the students, the 10 who wrote essays, as well as the 15 who didn't write essays, who were part of the original summer school group, but who stayed on the WhatsApp thread, really relied upon one another and needed one another. And I think in ways that they didn't necessarily see peer research as being as instrumental to their own research process as they ended up being. And thinking about ways, and this is something I've thought about in my own advising, is how to create more peer networks. And peer research networks are really built on trust and the willingness and ability to be vulnerable in front of people who you may see as your competitors on the job market, or people who you aren't necessarily set up to trust. And thinking about those. But I've also thought about my own role to be more empathetic, and also to talk more to my colleagues about empathy, about advocating for students, advocating for expanded funding windows, less adherence to formal requirements and timelines, recognizing that even as some are able to return to work as usual, for others that may never be a possibility, and to recognize that we need more flexibility in our structures that can allow for the variations in the research process, and that as a department chair, as an advisor, is a position that I have to be able to advocate against, and in response to my institution, to support our students. And then thinking about how we disseminate, I think, conferences need to be rethought. I think fundamentally rethought, not just in light of the pandemic, but in light of climate change, and in light of the fact that we can't justify spending that number of carbon miles to get to a conference in a small room of people, to present our work in an odd slot on the conference program. But we do need face-to-face contact. And so what are the sort of most beneficial formats for facilitating that kind of engagement? And I have to put in a plug for the summer school, or the doctoral school that we run through IGER, and thinking about more professional development opportunities where senior scholars can work more with junior scholars, where peer networks can be built for junior scholars, thinking about the more impactful face-to-face interactions that maybe aren't just traveling across the world to present something we could have done over Zoom. We've talked a lot about the informal interactions, but how can we maximize those and maybe minimize the parts that aren't as useful for people to do face-to-face? And then also thinking about a range of publishing options. The long form research article that we know and love or hate has benefits, but it has limits, and it's not the only way that we can talk about the research that we do. And I've been thinking a lot, in my role in the journal, about formats like Spotlight On, other essay-based formats that can disseminate work and help students get their ideas out there and their contributions out there, that maybe don't necessarily lend themselves to the kind of slow publication window, time frames, and the paywalls, and and all of the challenges that we know exist with academic publishing. But how can we think about different formats? So these are just some of the 3 areas that I think we do need to rethink. Obviously, field work just needs to be rethought in logistical terms, but I think advising peer support and thinking about research dissemination are other areas that I think we can and should be thinking about in light of the inequalities exposed and perhaps the opportunities that have emerged. So now, hopefully, I can stop talking and we can make this a little more participatory, but I would love, I'm not exactly sure how we're doing on time. I think I more or less stayed in the window that I was supposed to. But I think we do have some time to hear about your experiences or things that others have learned in this process. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm also interested to hear from you as well.
Thank you so much.
Hold on.
I'm not sure what just happened, but thank you very much for your talk. So let's give everybody, if everyone could give Liza a hand and thank her for a great presentation. It's very appreciative. We very much appreciate you. So thank you so much. lots and lots of things to think about. And maybe if you could stop sharing your screen, then you could see and then that might be.
That makes sense. Yes, absolutely.
And then, great. And so then for this part of the talk, we have a really large group, so please raise your hand and feel free to make a comment or ask a question. And Jacob, I think you're first up.
And I am in
I
the
am
process
muted. Oh,
of
yeah.
making you a host.
Oh, okay, great. That was really incredible, and I have so many questions and comments. One of the things and I had so many similar experiences being a parent of a young kid, and in this weird profession. And one of the things that I've been kind of reflecting on is how the pandemic really kind of intensified the frequency and magnitude of kind of ups and downs of both everyday life and careers. And I for example, will never forget that the night before I got my first accept at the American Sociological Review, I had a police officer point a gun in my face during a Black Lives Matter protest. And so this was another thing that was going on, obviously, and thinking about how, and you spoke to this a lot, what are the lessons to learn about this period that we can kind of carry forward and in our practices. And the one that I've really been kind of struggling with the most is given the timeline of publication, and that it's just takes so long, that I think for a lot of people who had real productivity problems during the pandemic, like myself, that's not going to show up on my CV for 2 years. My 2020 and 2021 CV lines look great, but that's because all that work was done kind of before or right at the beginning of the pandemic. And my 2022, 23 is going to be pretty spare. And I'm just wondering how you're thinking about kind of incorporating this into both as both someone who is going to be evaluating others, and as for the grad students here in particular, how to present yourself as someone who's going to be evaluated by others in this.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jacob. And yeah, all of those points. And yeah, I think this question of CV gaps is one that I'm quite concerned about, truthfully, because I'm afraid that we are going to forget. We're going to lose sight of why those gaps are there. I think we're just going to lose that sense of empathy that I think we had to have by necessity during the pandemic, because everyone was experiencing it. But the fact that everyone wasn't experiencing it the same is something that we really have to just keep saying. And I think people, who are not as burdened by it, or people who had more reliable childcare, or people who, just had other advantages, are, unfortunately, typically the ones who are going to be making a lot of the decisions about extending tenure clocks and evaluating CVs on the job market. And I just think we just have to keep saying it and acknowledging that it didn't go away, and that the worst effects on people's academic productivity specifically are only going to be revealed in the coming years. And I think that the danger that we're facing is amnesia or, just short-sightedness. And we just have to keep saying it to avoid that from happening. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I think that this is about using our positions that we have to say it in the rooms where tenure decisions are being made, where tenure clock, extensions are being evaluated, where hiring committees are meeting to discuss. And, and those of us who were already in a quite stable position pre-pandemic and had the luxury not to publish or had the luxury, we'll have to keep saying it. And I think that's sort of what else. Anybody have thoughts, an answer to that question? Any suggestions on how we do respond to the longer term impacts? I am curious. I mean, and I am by nature a glass half full kind of person, and I am excited perhaps about the new methodological innovations that students are employing, but that they've had to by necessity, that many of us have had to do. I think that this can be a time for kind of thinking about like a different kind of research. And I wouldn't say entirely that the structures we had in place pre-pandemic were great. I'm not sure those were the best structures. And if we do see new things emerging, new ideas, new ways of asking research questions and answering them, bringing data to bear on our questions, I think that's a good thing, or can be a good thing. Audrey, did you want to chime in on that point?
I did, yeah. I think one thing I am worried about people forgetting too, and I think that one way to deal with that is to start talking now and actually make a very public and transparent statement about how we will handle those things, so that when we, so that there's a record that, if young scholars were asked, for example, or beginning scholars were asked if they wanted to stop their clock, I think that why was the question put that way? Who was it put to? Who answered it this way? Who answered it that way? What are the implications for both groups? Things like that. I think that we can document them and make them very public, and we can think about the implications just as we do in our own research about how that might impact, and how we will, as a field or as fields, be equitable in our responses to those choices, if they were choices, and also to recognize that they weren't always choices, that they were false choices. I think the other thing that I would hope to see, that I really appreciated, I think you hinted at this, and I'm really curious about what you think about this. Sometimes the word rigor is used, well, rigor is discussed often as whatever was done in precedence. And there is no precedence for this really, in terms of, and I also want to acknowledge something that Jacob said. It wasn't just the pandemic. It was also the protests and the recognition that the world gave to the murder of George Floyd and police brutality throughout the United States since then. But I think that the word rigor is often used to try to hearken to precedents and to support a kind of supremacy. And so I'm wondering how the forced reality of the pandemic, the forced reality of the response to those to the public protests, how the reality will shape rigor. And what is the relationship between reality and rigor? And how do people who prefer something sort of like this rigor that can be jarred up and looked at and gazed at, and sort of it lives in formaldehyde in a jar somewhere, versus the real responses to research problems that occur in the field, in particular in urban settings, but not just in urban settings. So anyway, that was a lot, but any of those things, all of the above, you made me think, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your comments as well. And I like the way that you've put that phrase, the relationship between reality and rigor. And I agree fully that that this notion of rigor is used to gatekeep. It's used to, police the boundaries of, that have maintained certain inequalities in our research outputs. And I think the events of the past 2 years, the varieties of events have forced this conversation. I think, I've thought a lot in other parts of my work, and life, about the importance of shared experiences across class lines, across cultural lines, that like when people have something that they've shared, this is why natural disasters create policy windows, because, while, more marginalized communities have been experiencing disasters on a regular basis, what we often call a disaster or call a crisis is when it hits people who aren't generally hit by these things. And I think the crisis of the past couple of years has enabled a conversation on the relationship between reality and rigor that was relevant before and will continue to be relevant after the pandemic. And I think it has created, perhaps the optimistic response, new openings for other kinds of research, presentations. I think, we just had the annual board meeting of the journal that I edit, and this is a conversation we sort of have every year, is how do we get more submissions and successful submissions through from certain parts of the world, and not just people based in Europe and North America writing about those parts of the world. And we have that conversation every time, but I think there felt to be a new urgency about different formats of publishing, different kinds of, brief essays, web-based. I think all of our disillusionment with the pay models of academic publishing has also created new openings to abandon structures that are not just not working, but are working to maintain very sharp inequalities and gatekeep in really harmful ways. And so I think that just like we need to say out loud and create structures in place that allow us to have not opt in but opt out policies for tenure clock extensions, new publishing options that allow for a wider range of types of scholarship and types of scholars to be sharing their work and their research, their ideas. So I think we still have a couple of more minutes in the larger format. So I would really like to invite other comments, ideas from somebody who's not the instructor of the course, maybe, and others, to share your experiences maybe on how you are responding, or what you wish that, journal editors could hear, or, or your advisors would have done, or you wish that they would do, or you're happy they are doing. I think that, this is a space where the experiences of the of students, of people in your position, are really where we need to be looking to move forward.
I can jump in. I'm a second year doctoral student in the sociology department, so not a dissertator currently, and not necessarily at the point where I have to think about sort of these things myself. But there are just a couple of things. I really appreciated your presentation and some of the discussion that's happened so far. I think this is the first kind of conversation I've had like this, and I think it's really valuable. It's making me, these are just sort of general comments. I don't really have necessarily a specific question, but I sort of appreciate the conversation around inequality. Specifically, I think one of your most recent comments, just that for a lot of people, these inequalities have existed and they've known about them for a very long time. It's just, a pandemic or some kind of disaster brings them more into the mainstream in terms of what people are and communities are struggling with, which I think is kind of an important thing to think about. But I also think about the inequalities in sort of what people are able to talk about in terms of how the pandemic has affected their work. I am a graduate student with a child, so I think it's easier to talk about how home childcare has affected your work than it is mental health or some other kind of or loss in your family or in your community. And so there's sort of disparities there in terms of maybe what's acceptable in a professional context to talk about in terms of how your work has been affected. So I haven't actually had many of these conversations myself, but sort of in thinking about how we might, as a sort of industry, as academia, kind of be more empathetic and create space to have conversations, it's just got me thinking, like, even if we do, not everyone will be able to fully participate, and there will be disagreement as to what is appropriate to be sharing in a professional context as well. So these are just sort of things I'm reflecting on, but I really appreciate this talk that you've given and the opportunity to reflect with my peers and colleagues. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. I think that it's really important to normalize these conversations. I don't think that they won't fall prey to unequalizing tendencies, that certain constraints are more acceptable than other constraints. And I do think that will continue to be so. But I actually feel like the way to address this issue is to just maybe, I don't know, keep talking about it, and to create spaces where it's acceptable to talk about it, to have a research seminar that invites a conversation on this precise topic, to have conversations for advisors to talk to their students about their mental health struggles, to actually be able to say these things. I mean, I think there are many of the issues that I've talked about today are structural, and in the sense that there are institutions creating barriers around tenure, around funding, around publication processes. But there are other practices that are cultural, and I think we can shift the culture in our institutions to give more permission, to give more respect and honor to people's challenges. And I think that this is one thing that I've tried to normalize in my own department's conversations on this topic, not always successfully because there are barriers. We have disagreements on what are acceptable conversations to be having in these settings. And, there's been pushback from others who just feel like it's not appropriate, or who have been trained in a very different era of academia. I've had this conversation with a colleague of mine who was initially denied tenure when she went up in the early 1980s, and she worked very hard to self-discipline to really squeeze out any personal life that could be seen as a liability that she was carrying. And she finds it very difficult now to engage with a level of openness that her students want her to. And I think we have to respect that as well. That's trauma that she brings to these conversations. And it's not just that people don't want to have these conversations because they are not empathetic or they aren't considerate, but often because they've been disciplined by these institutions to hold back and to not have these conversations. And I think that that's okay too. But I don't think, I think we should try to be as respectful and work to, make people feel comfortable despite different perspectives on what are appropriate conversations. But I can't, like, I've already used this phrase and it's overused already, but I can't sort of unsee the experiences that particularly my international students, but also my students, based here who come from more, humble backgrounds, more marginalized communities, have less resources and cultural capital and financial and family connections that bring them to to higher educational institutions. I can't not know that they showed me their vulnerabilities, and even if we're taught to kind of tuck those back in, we have to allow. I mean, I just think that that's additional work, and we're also overworked already. The work of trying to hide the reality of our lives is just a burden that I don't think that we can take on in addition to the other things that we have to do. And these things are often easier said in a setting like this than they are to be put into practice. But I think the more we talk about them and just try to do them when we can, the more comfortable others will feel with our doing it.
Other comments or questions?
Yeah, Jeff.
Hi, thanks for such a wonderful presentation, both generous as well as, I think, insightful and what can encourage us all to be persistent. What I hear you, my field is really the subject, is really about leadership and change, especially cultural change, but also the aligning of systems to be consistent with culture. And one of the greatest quotes from that was from Peter Drucker, who said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. My only disagreement with that is I think culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and midnight snack. And so what I hear, from my vantage point and my experience, what I hear you really talking about is culture change within institutions. And my experience of that a lot over the last several decades is that these conversations are often had by folks who are not in the positions of leadership to really take them on. And that the constant question by folks in the position of a number of you in the room is, how can I manage up? How can I actually introduce these things in a way that then they will be received well and acted on, and it won't just result in additional job for me, but a process where we can actually co-create, where we can really collaborate here in getting very intentional about the cultural and systemic changes that we have in mind, and then experiment with them and see how it goes and learn from it, learn the right things from it, and keep moving forward together, which is absolutely the design process. And so I just offer that to you as a perspective that is completely outside of your field. I know nothing about your field experientially, but generically, it's perfect in terms of that being the challenge. So I'll just offer you that encouragement and exhortation.
I really appreciate that. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, that is a perspective that I don't often have when reflecting on these issues, in part because, I'm trained to do research on cities and to conduct qualitative work. And now I am finding myself chairing a sociology and anthropology department. And I've recognized that I have an opportunity, given the position that I'm in, to kind of create a particular sort of space within the department to try to, you know, achieve some of the objectives that I'm trying to. But it's also, you know, as we know, department leadership is, you know, the worst of middle management. And there is a lot of managing up, and, you know, educating people who are further and further away from advising students and being in the classroom, while also feeling more and more disconnected from my students. You know, in many ways, I feel like a graduate student myself, and they don't see me like that. And that difference in sort of self-perception and you know, external perception is something I've struggled with in this role, when, you know, I've noticed, you know, the students are trying to fight the man, and I've realized that I am sort of the closest that they see in their experiences to that, and resistance, you know, has often put me in the fray. But I think that, how do we shift higher education? Higher education is such a weird place, and we're inheriting all of these systems that we don't like, but we also are afraid of the alternative, as, you know, our institutions are trying to kind of tear down structures like tenure, and you know, and neoliberalize practices that weren't great before, but don't seem like they're getting much better. But I think, you know, in our little spaces, our subfields, our departments, our intellectual communities, we can, you know, start to normalize certain behaviors.